Hello friends, my name is Muddiness, and today I have a wrap up for you of the books that I read most recently. I feel like I probably should be spacing out my content a little bit more or a little more consistently, but you know, tomorrow's ability to even is not promised, so I'm just making these as I can. A funny thing happened, and it was that I finally made a video and I was talking about how I haven't been able to read as much during quarantine, if at all. And pretty immediately after I made that video and posted it and talked to you guys in the comments about how I wasn't reading that much, some switch flipped and I was like, you know what? I want to read now. And I been reading a lot in these last couple of weeks. It's so amazing. Like, I don't even want to talk about it too much because I'm scared that the opposite's gonna happen. That I just said I'm reading a lot and my brain's gonna be like, we're done now. Love to have a brain. I enjoy this a lot. I have 5 books to talk to you about today, and this is a June wrap up, but I literally read all 5 of these in the last week of June. So first up is Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston. In 1927, Hurston went to Alabama to interview and talk to what was then considered to be the last survivor of the Atlantic slave trade. This is a really interesting piece of work. It starts with this big introduction that talks about the piece itself, and so part of it is that since Hurston wrote it, we've learned more. So at that time, they thought that Lewis was indeed the last survivor of the Atlantic slave trade, but they found out that 2 people outlived him. They also have more information on where Cudjoe came from and other things of that nature that mean that this isn't always historically accurate, but it was accurate to the information that Hurston had at the time. The other part of it is that an early version of this work, or like a precursor of this work, was plagiarized by Hurston, and the introduction goes into how that came about and how we can interpret this and how the resulting work isn't plagiarized. The third part of it is that this wasn't published until 2018. Originally, publishing didn't want anything to do with it because a lot of it is written in dialect, and Hurston refused to change that, so it didn't even get out to us, the public, until 2018. So there are a lot of like historical pieces, and obviously Hurston is a very prolific writer in her own right, and so her role in this as a biographer, as a folklorist, is interesting in terms of the rest of the body of her work, but also in terms of Cudjoe's story. Everything about it is just absolutely heartbreaking. The fact that the ship that Cudjoe was on came to the United States after slave trading was ruled illegal, and so they like slipped it in even after it was illegal. Being enslaved is obviously really tough and heartbreaking to hear about, and then even after they found out that they were emancipated, because they got news of it years later, you see them trying to rebuild their lives and longing to go back to their home and being unable to. And even as he rebuilt his life and he had his family, you then hear his account of how his family members died and the way that they were persecuted, the things that they faced, and ultimately he was the last survivor of his family. And so it was something that felt very heavy. I just keep thinking about it. And the other piece of it that I really appreciated, it reminds me of a conversation that I recently had with my friend Nicole. I sent her a TikTok that was basically like a girl getting ready to go out running, and the caption was basically like me getting ready to go jogging while listening to podcasts about women getting murdered while jogging. And I sent it to her, and we got into this discussion about whether or not we enjoy personally like true crime podcasts, and neither of us particularly do. And her point of view, or one of the points that she made, was about the framing of a true crime podcast and how the reporter then becomes part of the story, and you can't necessarily divorce those two things, right? There is no way to report on or communicate the crime in the way that they do without then being involved in it in some way. And so that sort of framing, or that idea of how much the biographer or the storyteller is part of their work. And I kept thinking about that while reading this, especially because me reading it presently, I know who Hurston is. And this isn't necessarily her story, she's just communicating it, but I think that she does a really good job of acknowledging that she is now part of the story, and acknowledging the ways that she obtained the story and what they were doing when they were talking, and the ways that she went about getting him to talk about this. And I think that that is a really important lens to this, and she just approaches it very well. She's very transparent about it, and I think that she did an excellent job from, my interpretation and from what I know, but it feels like she did a really great great job maintaining Cudjoe's voice, his dialect, his words, his sayings. I really, really appreciated that. This, as I already said, is a very heavy book. I think you might struggle with it if you're not in like a mind frame to pay a little bit closer attention, because it is written in dialect and you kind of have to do that extra step to really understand everything that is happening. I think also if you're somebody who really narrowly sticks to traditional narratives, things that have a beginning, middle, and end, this might be a little out of your comfort zone because it doesn't have that. It really is just, you know, these are the times that I spoke to him and this is what he said. It covers his whole life, but it kind of meanders, and there are other stories interwoven in there, so it doesn't have that strong feeling of a narrative, which I know is something that some people need to enjoy. Otherwise, this was a fantastic work, and I think it is something that is worth giving our ear to. I don't know, it just felt important to listen to this particular story, and I'm very happy that I did, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read How Not to Get Shot and Other Advice from White People by D.L. Hughley. I know absolutely nothing about D.L. Hughley's comedy, his work, him as a person. Like, I was not attracted to this because of the writer. I picked this up probably the way that a lot of us are picking things up these days. I was looking at lists of works about anti-racism or being Black in America or things of that nature, and I was particularly looking for books that I hadn't necessarily heard about. So like, I've read a lot of the big more well-known ones, so I was looking for things that maybe were a little bit more unknown or underrated or things of that nature. How Not to Get Shot is like an extended comedy routine, to be honest. It's a very satirical look at the sort of advice that you get from white people about how Black people should behave or how we should approach the current state of racism or police brutality in the United States, things of that nature. I will say that that kind of unrelenting satire might be a reason people won't enjoy this. The tone is very in your face. It is what it is, and it doesn't let up through the entire thing. The reason that I feel like I enjoyed this more than I expected to was that by this point I was absolutely tired of having the same conversations over and over again and hearing a lot of this like surface level backlash that you get, the things that are so utterly ridiculous that we can't get past, but having these conversations and not being able to get through to people. And a lot of times this was with family and close friends, right? These are the conversations and the people that I can't necessarily get away from. So just kind of that over and over and over again of things of like, what about Black on Black crime? And you know, I was absolutely feeling gaslit and fed up, and I picked this up and it just felt like a balm at that moment because it was making fun of these things and it was making me feel like I wasn't the crazy one. In the satire, in the comedy, in the framing of the way that he picks apart these arguments, it really goes a long way to be like, yes, what you are hearing is indeed ridiculous. And that's kind of what I needed. And just the ability to kind of laugh about it, to take a step back and, you know, not that any of these things are particularly funny, but just kind of laughing at the completely absurd sorts of things that people feel comfortable telling you when you're a Black person. I wouldn't say that this goes too deep on any one topic. It touches a bunch of topics, and it just kind of, like I said, hits those surface level kind of arguments that you hear a lot and, you know, makes fun of them, takes a crack at them, and point out why a lot of these things don't make sense. Don't make sense even if we wanted to take this advice seriously from white people about how not to get shot in this country. Like, what they're saying doesn't make sense anyway. So that's what this book is. I'm kind of waffling here because I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend it, and I'm not sure that I would have like loved it in other circumstances, but it just felt right for the moment that I read it. I will say that I had a gripe with it at the very end. He goes into this idea about how some marginalizations you can't hide. And I think this is a really important point. I've been thinking about it, especially when we talk about own voices and how that's different for the LGBTQIA community, because there is a level of not having to kind of come out about these things versus how that's different for somebody who can't hide. I can't hide my marginalization. There's no amount of coming out as Black because, you know, people look at me, they know what I am, and that affects how I move through society. And so I think that that is a very important conversation, as long as we understand that there's no value in comparing marginalizations or trying to one up each other here in terms of who gets, you know, screwed over more by society. But the way that Hughley approaches this conversation, I did not agree with the language that he used, and I did not necessarily agree with the conclusions that he made. It wasn't something super overt, and it also was literally like a couple pages at the end, but it didn't sit well with me. So because of that, I ended up giving this 3.5, 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I picked this up for the June House Salt Book Club, which the live show is already live, and I did a reading vlog about this, which ended up being mostly a review. I thought I would do a reading vlog and then like a sit down standalone review, but I cannot get much further in my talking about this, like past why. Like I'm stuck at the why this exactly happened or why this story was told. And in talking about it in those 2 other instances, I have heard from other people who enjoyed it more than I did and who have answered that particular why, like what they saw of value in this story. I just disagree with the effectiveness of this book. So for instance, some people said that this was more of like a psychological look at President Snow, that it was just trying to basically show us who this man is that we knew was the villain in the original Hunger Games trilogy, but now we get to take a closer look at who he is. I don't think that this did that particularly well because we weren't close enough into his thoughts and feelings to really feel like this was like a deep psychological dive into the psyche of a madman or anything like that. It also didn't work for me in terms of like an origin story because I feel like we don't start anywhere very different from who Snow ends up being. I think that he's really bad at the beginning and his methods for violence like increase or change, and that's really what this story felt to me to be about, is that he gets exposed to different methods of population control and violence. And like, okay, if that's the story that you really wanted to bring back and tell us, is that the man that we met in the future doing all of these violent things in the past was exposed to violent means and methods, like thanks for letting us know. I just didn't really think that it was necessary. I know some people really enjoyed this because of the callbacks to the original Hunger Games trilogy, but I did not enjoy those either. I think that they were very ham-fisted, they were very in your face, and I think that a lot of them took away from the original trilogy, like what that whole story was. Katniss is like a nobody, and people see her and start investing in her story, and she becomes a symbol for a revolution, kind of whether she wants to or not. And whether she wants to or not flip-flops throughout the series. Sometimes she's like, yeah, let's do this. And sometimes she's like, why, oh God, why? And that is her story. Like the fact that she is not the one who is leading the fighting, but she becomes this symbol, and the exploration of like the propaganda of that, and this idea of like PR and marketing and all of that. I think that that is one of the neatest things about the original trilogy. But then you come back here, and basically what Collins does is tell us that Snow's hatred of Katniss isn't all that like, I just hate what she stands for. Like there are specific reasons and connections between Snow and Katniss. There are reasons that once she started to come up that he would have been like, oh, I take this personally, instead of it just being like, oh, this nobody is getting people to rally behind her. And I hate that because I realize that when the oppressed rally, when the oppressed get together, then that spells trouble for me. That I feel like is a compelling story. Like, I don't care who this person is, she's become a symbol, and I hate that. And Collins comes back to turn this into a story of not only is this person a symbol, but I had direct reasons to hate her specifically, and I don't like it. Like, I don't like that. I don't like it at all. This is why I can't do like a standalone review, because I just come back to why and hearing an answer and being like, well, I don't want it. Other than that, I thought that this was very boring at the beginning, poorly paced. The sort of divisions or the separations in the story and like the 3 pieces that it tells you, I don't think work very well together. I really resent the idea that we came back to take this look at how Snow became who he was, or what kind of person he was, and that we just tie it to violence against women. That's not surprising, honestly. You know, the child murderer also hates women. not a surprise to me. I just think that is one of the laziest storytelling devices that we currently have in our arsenal. Anytime that we are telling about a fantasy world or a dystopian world, and your shorthand for look how bad it is look at the way they treat women, it's lazy and also like, welcome to the present. Welcome to a current dystopian, I guess. I don't know. I don't like that as a singular reason, or to have that as kind of just that background piece of like, look at how bad it is without interrogating that further. And so to come back and be like, let's talk about how Snow became who he was, and then to tie that to a woman that he ultimately tries to possess and control and hurt, it's super lazy storytelling to me. It isn't compelling, and I did not enjoy reading it. I gave this 1.5 out of 5 stars when I originally read it on the live show, but after sitting with how much I did not like it, I think it's a 1-star read. Truly, I could go on and on about this. I've like skimmed so many details. You know, there's so much here that you can really talk about not being good, which is why I keep thinking like, am I done talking about this? But we'll see. This is my new 9th house. I talked about 9th house for months before I felt like all my anger was out, so we'll see how long this goes. I apologize for having a lot of feelings. Speaking of feelings, next up is Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. Okay, let's talk about this. This is sort of autobiographical. However, Echo Brown, the author, takes the story of her life and she infuses it with fabulism. So there is this magical aspect to it. Echo in the story is a wizard, and so she finds out about these powers, but her mother is very hesitant for her to practice them and to really know what it means to be a wizard. So we follow Echo throughout her life from when she's, I think, about 6 years old, entering into school, until she gets older and she's preparing for college and all of this. When I tell you, I know that I say this all the time because I am emotional, but when I tell you that this book made me cry, I'm talking about sobbing in my bed in the middle of the night because I couldn't stop reading it, but also it was absolutely breaking my heart. So first, let's talk about the fabulism. I feel like when you hear about fabulism or magical realism, there's an immediate association you make of the sort of like atmosphere and magic that those stories typically have, but the magic in here was very matter of fact. There isn't that sort of like flowery, hazy atmosphere. The magic is just very bald. It's very, this is what it is. Some of it is unexplained, but the majority of it is metaphorical, so it just is very matter of fact. If you come into this expecting something that is more fantasy, which is what I saw a lot of reviews saying, or if you're coming in to expect the text to convince you that this magic exists, I feel like this is not that story and you will leave disappointed. I also saw a lot of reviews talking about how this was too much or that it was a lot. This does have a ton of content warnings, and I will leave those in the description, or I'll link my Goodreads review that has them, because it is a lot. But I think that part of what they're missing is, one, that this is based on a true story. It is partly autobiographical, and two, the fact that it is a lot doesn't take away from the fact that this is what a lot of Black people face in the United States. Like, these are circumstances that are not fictional, even if you read them and they make you uncomfortable. That said, it is a lot. I mean, I was sobbing in my bed. So you have to be definitely within the right mind frame to consume the story, and, you know, like I said, check out the content warning and make sure that this is something that you can consume without it being harmful to you personally. Another thing that Brown does that I just loved, and I understand why people might not, but she does this broken up timeline where she begins by telling you an event, and it's usually something that is very critical or crucial in Echo's life, and then she interweaves that with another mirrored event, and so she cuts back and forth between these two things where literally one word transitions you into this other scene, and back and forth and back and forth. It is very jarring. It feels like something you would see more like on a TV show in terms of like flipping back and forth in a montage style almost between two related or connected scenes, but she does it in words. And so I understand why that might be jarring for people, but I thought it was so incredibly well done, and it adds to the entire like sense or atmosphere of this book. It's disruptive in a way that makes it clear that these are moments that are almost like disrupting Echo's life or her timeline, or setting her on these different paths or courses. This was absolutely beautifully written. It had some of the most beautiful language and storytelling that I've read in a while. My heart went out to Echo immediately. Her story, I was basically on the edge of my seat trying to figure out how this would end for her, how it would go for her. The messages in here are ones that really struck me. I kept thinking about, and part of the reason I was crying was because of how I was thinking about how this applies to my own life. And this entire idea of the dreams that you bury in order to survive, and the seeds that are planted in your life by other people's words or other people's kind of view of who you are and what you can achieve, and whether or not you've let those seeds flourish in your life. I also really appreciated that this did not romanticize surviving. It absolutely gives credit where it's due for Black women who survive nearly impossible situations, but it doesn't romanticize it. What it says is that we should not have to survive these things, but we do. The line that stands out to me is that she says surviving is a bloodbath, and you know, nobody should have to do that. Truly, this is one of the best books that I've read all year, and I would not be surprised if it comes out on as #1 by the end of the year. It's a book that I'm going to universally recommend with those content warnings in mind. It's something that I'm not going to forget soon, that I would reread, even though knowing full well that it's going to wreck me. This was beautiful and haunting and achingly real, and I'm just so glad that I read it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. The final book that I read was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I recently did a video reviewing this book and 2 other books by Dominican authors, so I will link that on the screen. But to summarize, this is a story about 2 sisters that don't know about each other. Camino lives in the DR and Yahaira lives in New York, and they find out about each other after they receive the news that their father has passed away on a plane crash. So they find out basically that he had a family in the DR and a family in New York, and they have to come to terms and deal with the grief that they feel over his loss, but also about finding out that the other exists and what that means and their relationship to each other. This is a novel told in verse, which The Poet X was her first book, and With the Fire on High it was not, even though it was still very lyrical, very poetic. This returns to the format of a novel told in verse, and it was just beautiful. I really enjoyed that a portion of it was set in the DR, and so you get a closer look at some of the settings there and the culture and what it is to live on the island. I liked that we took a look at sort of these 2 different sides of it. So Yahaira thinks a lot about being Dominican and what that means when you've never been to the island, and connection to culture when you are part of the diaspora. I related to that so much. But the other end of that is Camino in the DR having family in the US, and how you look at that. The way that, you know, the US is this opportunity, and the way it's almost romanticized by people looking to get out of their current situation or whatnot. So I really appreciated that you got both of those points of view. This is a story that is a lot about grief and tackling grief, and she marks time as you read as days since they kind of got the news. And so you very clearly see the passage of time and grief, which was a really neat way to kind of carry this story forward. And as always with Acevedo books, or 3 for 3 at least, it ends in a really happy and hopeful way, which is part of why I love her books. Overall, this was well told, and it's always just so impressive to me how well she manages to tell these stories in such little space. Like, people wish they could tell as complete of a story as Acevedo does with half the words, because she's telling them in verse. So it's super impressive. I highly recommend all of her books always to you guys. 5 out of 5 stars. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I mentioned, let's chat down in the comments. I don't know how I got on this reading kick. My best advice is go online and make a video about how you're not reading, and then your brain will go, ha ha ha, we are gonna read. It's not a proven theory. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Like, I don't want the hanging tree to have anything to do with snow. I don't want it.